Good afternoon, good morning, and welcome to the Douglas and Sarah Allison Auditorium. We, of course, welcome those who are joining us on our heritage.org website on all of these occasions. Would ask everyone here to make sure your cell phones have been turned off as we prepare to begin. And of course, our internet viewers are always welcome to send questions or comments, simply emailing us at speaker@heritage.org. Hosting our initial discussion this morning and introducing our special guest is Dr. James J. Carafano. Dr. Carafano is Vice President for Foreign and Defense Policy Studies, the E.W. Richardson Fellow, as well as Director of our Catherine and Shelby Cullum Davis Institute for International Studies, distinguished as the employee with the longest title at the Heritage Foundation. Jim?
Say the longer your title, the less relevant you are. There actually isn't a better time for this event. I'm sure a lot of you have been following the conversation about Obamacare and this, kind of this backwash from the American people that's saying, wow, this is a big deal. And we don't think our government's actually done the right thing here. And what's interesting for a lot of us who have been engaged in foreign policy is we've actually been saying that about foreign policy for a really long time. And I think when people stop and take stock of where we are, they're going to find there's a lot of Obamacares. And actually, none of them are actually greater than they are in foreign policy. One of the things that I'm most excited about having Congressman McCaul here today is because his passion really lines up very well with something that we've been very concerned about for a really long time. One of the things that Kim Holmes did when he was vice president, and some of us, is we sat down, because if you remember back when President Obama first came in office, there was a real question about, well, what's his foreign policy, since he didn't really have much of a track record. And after about a year, we sat down in a kind of very objective, nonpartisan way and just mapped out, we said, this is the Obama Doctrine. This is how we believe he will act as a foreign policy president. And I think that document holds up very, very well. It is how he has functioned. And I think it hasn't worked well. And I think there is kind of a corollary between Obamacare and foreign policy. And to have Congressman McCaul here today to talk about this is really extraordinary because he is the guy that's at the center of the storm. I mean, he is looking at the problem from a person who has oversight of the department that's supposed to be defending us from the inside out. So he has to look at the world and what's coming at us, and then what we're doing to deal with that. So there really isn't anybody better suited, really, to kind of launch us on a conversation of really understanding of where we are today in the world. So we are absolutely delighted and honored to be joined by Congressman Michael McCaul, who is currently serving as the 5th-term representative of the Texas 10th District in the United States. And I guess that's from Houston to Austin. Representative McCaul is the chairman of the House Committee on Homeland Security. As chairman, he has prioritized the threat of international and domestic terrorism, cybersecurity, airport security, and addressing the management within DHS, which is a challenge all in of itself. He is co-founder and co-chair of the Congressional High Tech Caucus and the Cybersecurity Caucus. In 2008, Congressman McCaul co-chaired the Commission on Cybersecurity for the 44th presidency, which along with the CSIS developed and presented recommendations to President Obama to secure cyberspace and protect our national interests. Prior to Congress, Michael McCaul served as the Chief of Counterterrorism and National Security in the U.S. Attorney's Office in the Western District of Texas and led the Joint Terrorism Task Force charged with detecting, deterring, and preventing terrorist activities. So what we're going to do today, just administratively, is Congressman McCaul is going to come up, and he's going to address, I think, really the big picture of where we stand today in the world widely. So it's a perfect introduction, and then what he's done, he's agreed to take some questions, and we'll take questions from the audience, and then after that, we're going to bring up a panel, and the panel is going to specifically focus on the threat of counterterrorism. And I just wanted to mention, if there's a research project that I'm as proud of as the work we did on the Obama Doctrine. About 2 years ago, Lisa Curtis and some of the analysts at Heritage and some other folks wrote a paper called The Counterterrorism Strategy for the Next Wave, where really one of the most important documents of President Obama's administration, the new counterterrorism strategy, came out, and I guess it was 2011. They did really a very sober and constructive net assessment of the strategy and where they thought it would lead. And the conclusion of that report, we were just talking about this, is really prescient. I mean, everything that we said that was going to happen has happened. The proliferation and resurgence of the threat and the diversification of the threat that we're seeing today. So you're going to hear from a bunch of experts, some of which worked on this report. And I think that report, along with the Obama Doctrine, is two very foundational pieces of work that I'm really, really super proud of. But now I am most proud, most honored to welcome Congressman McCaul to the stage. So please join me in welcoming him.
Thank you. It's great to be here today, and James, thanks for that introduction. James and I have been through a lot, and we recently been discussing border security issues and as it relates to immigration reform. And I think you and I have put this dialogue and policy debate on the right track, and so I'm very proud of our efforts together. Let me just start by saying you get elected to chairman, you don't get appointed. And so I got elected by my peers, and one of the first things I decided to do, being from Texas, I understand that New York is still the #1 threat from al-Qaeda. So I went up to New York and visited with Ray Kelly, the police chief, who I would have liked to have seen as the new secretary, along with maybe Thad Allen or Ed Davis. But we had dinner together, and the mayor, Bloomberg. And they asked me about my family. Tell me about your family. I said, well, I've got 5 kids, and I've got 2 teenage daughters and triplets that are 12 years old. Triplets are identical twin girls and a boy, so we have a lot of homeland security issues in my house as well. But they usually focus on the triplets, but, it was interesting. Ray Kelly said, teenage daughters. He said, I've got a couple of those. And I said, oh. And he said, well, do you know the difference between a teenage daughter and a terrorist? I said, no, sir, I don't. He said, well, you can negotiate with the terrorist. Some of you are too young to have teenage daughters, so you may not get the import of that joke. But I'm finding sometimes in reality it's somewhat true. But anyway, it is a real honor to be here to talk about what I consider to be one of the most important issues. Now, we do talk a lot about Obamacare, and that's extremely important. But when it comes to our national security, our foreign policy, under the Constitution, this is perhaps the #1 priority under the Constitution. So, and what better place to talk about that than Heritage? And I want to thank all of you for the fine work you do here. As a think tank, members of Congress, we rely on your product extensively. I have in my 5 terms, and it gives us it's a great educational institution for members of Congress. And so thank you for your service, for what you do. But today I want to talk about really the administration's approach to foreign policy as it relates to the threats facing our nation, and how mixed signals and a refusal to engage in last-ditch efforts have affected our national and homeland security. The United States partners feel betrayed. They feel cut off. They feel confused by this administration's policies. The root cause of this is the fact that the Obama administration has never had a global leadership vision for the United States. American exceptionalism, the idea that the United States is qualitatively different from other countries, isn't embraced by this administration. I believe that's because this president rejects the idea of American exceptionalism and our power and our place in the world. My father was a World War II veteran, flew in a B-17, a bombardier. His generation left a better country to the next. I'm concerned what we're leaving to this generation. They left a safer nation, a global power. What are we really today? He rejects this idea and our power in the world, and we're left with a fractured and a reactionary approach to foreign policy. The administration has operated from a precarious position for the past 5 years. They've maintained the narrative that they are leaders who will end wars and support democracy, while at the same time withdrawing from the world stage, where the stakes really couldn't be higher. They've said regarding terrorism that this war, like all wars, must end, and go out of their way to not use the word terrorism. It's been taken out of the vernacular. When I go on trips, foreign trips, it's amazing how the State Department will not use the word terrorism or radical Islam. Even the CIA chief of stations have been instructed not to use these words. They've said that it must end, and they go out of their way not to use these words, much less the word radical Islamist terrorism, which sends a message overseas that we are not just growing weary of the fight, but we can't define who the enemy is. And I think that's very important to define who the enemy is. And consequently, the Obama Doctrine, as I call it, is a contradiction in terms. From Syria to Egypt, foreign policy promises have not been kept, red lines have been crossed, and relationships crucial to confronting terrorism have gone cold. All this has come as al-Qaeda is not on the run, but in reality is spreading like a wildfire across the Middle East and northern Africa. The atrocities in Syria, the collisions of tensions in Egypt, and the horrific coordinated attacks in Kenya, Pakistan, and Nigeria, all signals of al-Qaeda's escalation, not its demise. And now more than ever, it is crucial that we engage our partners abroad who are on the front lines of this threat, from Israel to Egypt. And yet this president consistently confounds our allies with his inconsistency, inaction, and indecision, which in my opinion destabilizes relationships which are most crucial to our intelligence partners. What are the risks to national security? Well, this administration's inconsistency has demonstrated that the United States is no longer the steadfast partner so many around the world have relied on for 75 years. Since World War II, we have seen what happens when the United States pulls back. The void is filled by another power, leaving the United States in a position with less leverage to accomplish its economic and security goals. Through significant missteps, the administration has alienated some of our staunchest allies. And this morning I'm going to focus on how those missteps increasingly put our nation's national security at risk. Al-Qaeda continues to be the main actor in the world who desires and plots to strike our homeland. I get the same briefings the President of the United States gets. When he says it's pre-9/11, either he is misrepresenting these briefings or he's not attending these briefings. Terrorists and al-Qaeda and others see weakness in the president's rhetoric, that al-Qaeda is decimated on the run, a sentiment that shows a lack of resolve, and based on my intelligence briefing, as I've stated, is incorrect. The reason the administration would like us all to believe that the threat is diminished is so he can treat it as a law enforcement problem, not as a military problem. Something to be policed instead of destroyed. This mindset didn't work prior to 9/11, and it won't work now. Al-Qaeda is growing its network, a spider web of affiliates that are linked to the direction of Osama bin Laden's top lieutenant, Zawahiri. Al-Qaeda continues to grow, as demonstrated in Syria, having not one but two Al-Qaeda factions. The Syrian situation demonstrates a direct and continued threat to the homeland as jihadists all across the world are globally moving into Syria for training. And when they leave Syria, my concern is where will they go? The large quantities of chemical and biological weapons in Syria cause me great concern as affiliates of al-Qaeda continue to grow and take control of territory, which they call the Caliphate, and a territory which houses chemical and biological weapons facilities. 2 years ago, the administration had a window of opportunity to arm moderate rebel forces and turn the tide of the civil war in favor of an outcome that could favor U.S. interests. But now that window has passed. Extremists make up a majority of the rebel forces, and the war is on a destructive path set to engulf the region in a sectarian struggle between Shia and Sunni. The administration failed to act when it could, and it lacked the resolve to enforce its own stated red line. In a last-ditch effort, it threatened to perform an incredibly small strike in an effort to save face instead of really effecting change. These failures created a leadership vacuum, now filled by Russia, and created the greatest era for questioning the United States' objectives in modern times. Worsening the situation in our relationship with allies in the region, the administration marginalized Saudi Arabia. When asked for protection for any fallout of a United States strike on Syria, the administration told Saudi Arabia that they just couldn't support them. This obviously angered the Saudis, and it was recently manifested in Saudi Arabia's downgrading its work with our CIA, a critical counterterrorism tool, and the turning down of a seat, which was extraordinary, at the UN Security Council that they had sought for years. Both of these breakups represent a strategic blunder and a substantial decrease in our national security efforts with a critical intelligence sharing partner. The destabilizing of relationships with our allies in the Middle East was perhaps even more evident with this administration's erratic policy towards Egypt. Instead of explaining what America expects and the ramifications of failing to deliver, the administration simply cut off billions of dollars in military aid overnight. This inconsistency destabilized our relationship with our largest partner in the Arab world. Our military relationship with Egypt is one of the most important security and intelligence tools, and the administration's waffling over whether to maintain it did more damage than withdrawing the aid itself. Now it is time to build up the stabilizing forces in the region, not run away from them. Ultimately, these decisions have given reason for our Middle East partners to distrust us. When it comes to countering Iran, we should not be counted on. This has since left Saudi Arabia and Israel looking for other ways to ensure that they are protected as Iran gains more power and influence in the region. If they don't believe we will support them, when Iran is on the verge of making their first nuclear weapon, they may look toward an earlier strike to delay this outcome, a move which has the potential to see the United States dragged into a larger conflict. Our allies also, who know the players in the region and who have much higher stakes than we do, believe our diplomatic show with Iran is dangerous. They have warned us to be circumspect in complying with concessions as we negotiate with Iran on halting their nuclear program. Our allies believe our diplomatic effort and concessions on sanctions will ultimately embolden Iran, whose growing influence in the region can be seen in Syria and now in Iraq. President Obama must see threats for what they are, or we will inevitably repeat the past mistakes that we made with North Korea. I submit that Iran is playing right out of the North Korean playbook right now to get this, the sanctions lifted, and then we'll discuss negotiations. This is exactly the wrong course. It's what Vice President Cheney told me he regretted in their administration, was the fact that they lifted sanctions and then negotiated, and then North Korea played us like a fiddle. We can't make the same mistake in Iran. We should say, rather, you stop your nuclear weapons program, and then we will lift the sanctions. But they have to make the first move. As Israeli Prime Minister Benjamin Netanyahu recently advised about the new president of Iran, he is a wolf in sheep's clothing, and he answers to the same Ayatollah who has sought nuclear weapons for decades. As the president continues to preach engagement and perseverance, our nation continues to cut ties with those who are fighting battles in the Middle East alongside us. There are many recommendations I would offer the president, but the most important would be to recognize that America is not and cannot be a great power without great leadership, great vision, and actions to back up its rhetoric. The United States will either exert power and influence in the world, or we will cede it. The Obama hallmark of debating each side as a lawyer and splitting the different frames of every aspect of his governing puts the United States in a place of little leverage. Secondly, the threat posed by al-Qaeda and its affiliates from Syria to Somalia to Indonesia require that we work closely with our partners and develop new relationships to counter this threat at a local level before they reach our shores, before they reach the homeland. As terrorists become more and more technologically savvy, diverse, and learn how to circumvent our counterterrorism efforts, the relationships we have throughout the world will increasingly become more critical. We can't win the war on terror alone. Leadership is not always about doing the job yourself. We need the international community, not a go-it-alone approach. And it is building up your assets through military aid, education, and strength that increases our combat effectiveness. This is, I submit, a lot cheaper and cost-effective than war itself. We need more than just drone strikes that can't kill an ideology alone. Strikes that can have blowback effects. Soft partnerships for intelligence sharing we need, so we can anticipate where new threats are coming from. I would also submit that the day of occupying countries is over. Counterterrorism abroad is a military function. We have seen what happens when the administration goes after a target with the military and the mission is accomplished. But when law enforcement, and I was a federal prosecutor for many years, worked with the FBI, but when law enforcement leads the charge in this war on terror, such as in Benghazi today, we wait with no results. The administration needs to permit immediately the military to target the perpetrators of the attack on our special mission in Benghazi. In his speech at the National Defense University this year, the president discussed ultimately repealing the authorization for use of military force, which passed in the wake of 9/11. Instead of working to repeal the AUMF, we need to have a serious conversation about how we can reform it to continue to target those responsible for the attacks that day and who continue to plot to attack us against us currently. Terrorists who wish to destroy this country and its citizens are enemy combatants, not common criminals. And if we lose sight of that, we will learn nothing from the lessons of 9/11. Ultimately, we must engage with our foreign counterparts in areas where we can agree and recognize there will be numerous areas where we disagree. But going forward, we should focus on an important mutual interest: defeating radical jihadists. The Russians continue to suffer large losses in the Caucasus at the hands of the Chechen Islamist extremists, which the Boston bombers were tied to. These extremists can be seen in other battlefields around the world, like Syria, and they pose not only a threat to Russia, but also to the United States. Working together through our counterterrorism efforts and shared interests, we can share information, tactics, and procedures for combating this common enemy. These relationships are crucial to rooting out cells and stopping attacks like the Boston bombings. Finally, long-term partnerships do not happen overnight, and these mixed messages and signals by the president and the administration are the fastest way to end them. As we saw in Syria, you can't develop a working relationship overnight. You have to engage early and often to be effective during a crisis. In order to be successful in a long-term partnership building, the United States cannot simply say we support democracy and then abandon it during the rough transition. Egypt is a case in point. The U.S. supported President Mubarak, who I've met with several times, a long-term counterterrorism ally, a stabilizing force in the Middle East. But when he was expelled, the United States said they ran for cover, said we wouldn't support him, and we support democracy. But when the Muslim Brotherhood took the country over on a more radical path, the people and the military revolted to protect not only their interest, but ours as well. President Obama's response to this development was lengthy indecision and suddenly slashed military aid to the country, the very force cracking down on the Muslim Brotherhood and the threat. And shortly after, General al-Sisi, the commander-in-chief of the Egyptian armed forces, with whom our military had a long-standing relationship with, said the U.S. turned its back on Egypt. I can't tell you how important that is. The head of the Egyptian military saying the United States turned its back on Egypt. We can work with the democratic forces there, but through education and through government training to build the will and trust necessary to improve Egypt's economy and future. Navigating the road to democracy is a long, and as our history illustrates, is vitally important. But I think we need stability. And this president has created more instability in the Middle East, I would submit, than any other president has. It is stability we need, not the instability he is creating. In conclusion, the president is great at giving bold speeches. Probably better than the speech I'm giving here today. But it has not displayed the bold action necessary to give those words meaning. President Obama takes the opposite approach of President Teddy Roosevelt's mantra, to speak softly and carry a big stick. He instead speaks loudly and carries no stick. Erupting crises from Syria to Egypt demonstrates our haphazard interventions that occur too late and our promises of help are empty. We must revisit the way we see the world and adapt the new world paradigm and identify common ground through clear objections and strengthen working relationships. The administration's thesis that the United States can pull back from the world and not suffer is being disproven by the day. When America pulls back from the world, there are consequences. World War I and II were born in an era of American isolationism. As a leader of nations, it's our responsibility to provide a vision for the governments willing to work with us to root out the number one threat to this country, which is terrorism. This vision only works if the administration stops denying the threat and if there is strength behind the speeches. With that, let me just say thank you for the opportunity, the honor, and the privilege to speak before Heritage here today. Thank you very much.
So the congressman has agreed to take a few questions. So if you do have a question, if you just raise your hand, and then also if you'd wait for the microphone and then just kind of state your name and affiliation, that'd be great. So that way, because folks that are listening online can hear the question as well. And the first question we actually have is from someone who's listening online. Is it possible to gain a bipartisan foreign policy as when seen during parts of the Cold War where a country was united by a common enemy? Or is it possible to spread awareness of America's current enemy, radical Islam?
You know, in the wake of 9/11, it was one of the most unifying American experiences we had in history. And we were joined as a nation, both Republican and Democrat. I think when it comes to Israel, we are united in a bipartisan way. I have a letter with our leadership to continue the sanctions against Iran as they're attempting to negotiate, which I think is a mistake to lift the sanctions in the hope of negotiating with a radical theocracy. That has some bipartisan support. But the problem is when you have a president who defies reality, will not define the enemy for what it is, and that's radical Islam, who takes the language out of the vernacular. The guy who says we're in a pre-9/11 mentality, he denies that the threat is growing, not decreasing, that it's spreading like a wildfire across northern Africa. It's what I call the narrative. The narrative, remember, Benghazi was not an act of terrorism. Remember that? There was a video that caused that. We all know the flags of al-Qaeda were flying around the compound. I questioned Secretary Kerry and Secretary Clinton on it. The forward communications, the cables that came to the State Department that were largely ignored, in fact, they were completely ignored, warning about the security conditions. And we saw what happened. We have an ambassador killed and 3 others. A narrative that says Fort Hood, close to my district, was workplace violence, not an act of terrorism. When we know that Mr. Hassan, I've seen the emails, traffic with him and al-Awlaki in Yemen, the number 2 terrorist in the world, literally asking him for permission to do exactly what he did. Can I kill soldiers to protect our brethren in Afghanistan in a dining hall? If I kill civilians innocently, is that okay? FBI had that information. They shared it with Washington field office. They didn't share it with Fort Hood. And I can go in depth on the Boston bombings and what we could have done differently there, but the long and short of it is the leadership starts at the top. And when the leadership denies reality and tries to wish things away and creates a narrative that defies reality, it's very hard to work in a bipartisan way. At the end of the day, national security issues, above all, should be bipartisan. I've attempted to govern my committee as chairman of Homeland Security in a bipartisan way. In fact, every bill I've gotten out of my committee has passed in a bipartisan way, and I think that's what we need to govern. And I think that's important that we try to do that. And certainly, when it comes to national security issues, we should, but I just personally think this president is weak on national security. I don't think, quite frankly, he's interested in it. It's not where his interest lies, which is why he doesn't attend many of his national security briefings.
Close up that question. I want to put Anna on the spot to ask a question for you. She was on Latin America issues, and that's a place that we don't normally talk about.
Well, I guess one thing, since there's been a lot of discussion about Hezbollah potentially coming in through the Mexican border into Texas, and I was wondering what's your opinion on it, if you could elaborate on it, because the administration tends to downplay that, but reports that I've seen, that's definitely not the case. So,
Yeah, when I was a counterterrorism federal prosecutor, I was very concerned about that back then. That was 10 years ago. Hezbollah is here. There are support cells here, finance cells. They're not operational cells, but they can't convert. My concern is the relationship between Iran and Venezuela. And we've seen individuals coming out of that region through Venezuela, and very easy to get a visa to Mexico. And from there, you know how porous the border, which, James, that's why I've worked so hard on my border security bill to keep that threat outside the United States. All these threats I see, my number one goal is to keep them outside the United States and not allow them to get in. There have been Pakistanis I've been worried about coming that we've caught at the border, not knowing what was their intention trying to come in. I don't want to be an alarmist and engage in a lot of hyperbole, but it is a concern. And of course, when you saw the Saudi ambassador plot, I was always told, oh, well, you know, Hezbollah is just finance support. They're not operational. They would never work with the drug cartels. The cartels are just interested in making money. I do think they want to distance themselves from terrorism, but at the end of the day, that was a classic example of a guy who thought he was working with the drug cartels to assassinate the Saudi ambassador. He was a Hezbollah operative out of Mexico. He actually lived in Austin, in my hometown. So that defied all the briefers. You know, they always downplay the threats when they brief me. I always told them I think the threat's more real, and that was a classic illustration of where, you know, they were wrong. I do think it's a problem, not just al-Qaeda. You know, you got the Shia-Sunni thing going on. So what I'm really concerned about is as the tension with Iran and Israel increases, so does the threat of Hezbollah and Hezbollah operatives in the United States. If a strike occurs against Iran, which, you know, with the way we're mishandling Iran right now with their nuclear program, could be more and more likely, that will light up Hezbollah, not only in the Middle East, in that region, but also here in the United States. And my concern would be those cells becoming operational in the United States, hitting targets like synagogues, you know, Jewish symbols, like they did in Buenos Aires in Argentina. They blew up the Jewish center there. I was in New York just recently and talking about Ramzi Youssef, the World Trade Center bomber in '93, his original target were 12 synagogues, not the World Trade Center. And why 12? You have the 12 tribes of Israel. So they hate Israel. They hate the Jewish people, and they hate us because of that. They hate the West. So I think the threat is real, and it's something that ties back, as you and I have talked about a lot, James, and how can we get this border under operational control? It's not just an immigration issue, it's a national security issue. No, thanks for that question. Oh, and lastly, sequestration. You know what? The Navy's having to pull out of their interdiction efforts. Coast Guard's scaling back. So as we squeeze that quarter of just the discretionary pie under sequestration, and we're not allowed to touch, God forbid, the mandatory entitlement spending, we are jeopardizing our national security. As we, that quarter of the pie discretionary is the military. It's homeland security, it's national security interests. And every day it's making this world more dangerous for us. And it's all sacrificed on the altar of mandatory entitlement spending. I just can't emphasize how important it is that we address this issue as adults in the room and take on this mandatory entitlement spending, reform these programs to save them.
Okay, we have time for maybe one more question if there's a last question. Okay, ladies first. So we'll give you the last question, and then I have one question I want to ask you before we let you go. So.
Hi, I'm Deborah Weiss with Front Page Magazine, and I was just curious, what would be your recommended course of action in Syria now that we've missed the opportunity to help moderate rebels? Would you do nothing? Would you still strike? Or is there anything we can do besides stand idly by?
Well, I was on Face the Nation. Bob Schieffer asked me, what would you advise the president? And what I said was that what we need to do, the first objective is to secure and destroy the chemical weapons. Assad is a puppet of Iran. He's not a good guy. But the chance to help the moderate forces was 2 years ago. With the briefings I get daily now, and Steve, you and I have talked about this, unfortunately the rebel forces have been hijacked by al-Qaeda factions. They don't call them that, they call them radical Islamists who believe in the caliphate. Well, I don't know what the difference is between those two. The idea that we're arming and funding that element, I thought al-Qaeda was the enemy. And I've talked to some of the operatives working with them over there in this covert, and it's frightening to them who our allies are in that regard. So there's no good side to pick here, and there's no good outcome other than securing and destroying the weapons. And so what happened in the absence of leadership by the White House, Putin came in because the last thing he wants to see are jihadists taking over these weapons that they will in turn against him and potentially against us. Assad, as bad as he is, has never threatened to use chemical weapons against Western targets or the United States. The jihadists, they will. And so my number one goal is to keep these weapons out of the jihadists' hands. There's no good outcome. It's a very complex situation, but I think it's just what's happening right now with Putin. As much as a traditional enemy that Russia has been, the one shared interest we have that they warned us about on Boston, by the way, was these radical Islamists, the jihadists. They fear them just as much as we do, and that's our shared interest with Russia to combat them. Unfortunately, we disregarded their warning against the Boston brothers, and look what happened there. And I think working with them and the international community, as I mentioned earlier, I had Secretary Baker spoke at the Kennedy Center benefit for MD Anderson the other night about how, they always got the international community behind them before they went in. This president laid no groundwork for this, and at the last minute tried to throw together an incredibly small strike that would have inflamed the region, retaliated against Israel, and would have been a disaster. So I oppose that action. But ultimately, the international community's got to step in and destroy those weapons. It raises another interesting question. The old geopolitical analysis of Russia, Iran, Syria being the enemy, they traditionally are. But the idea that the Saudis, who we need to keep close intelligence ties with, because they work with us. We want a stable Saudi, not one where the Wahhabis erupt and take it over because we'll have an energy crisis. But the fact is, when I get these briefings, I say, I'm going back to my federal prosecutor days, where's the money coming from? Where's the terrorist financing coming from for these al-Qaeda, Sunni al-Qaeda related factions? Sir, they're coming from the UAE, Qatar, and the Saudis, wealthy families. We have to rethink this relationship as well. I think stability is important. This gets me to the point of energy independence, which was in my speech originally. But the Saudi prince said the greatest threat to their longevity is the Eagle Ford Shale. The more we can produce energy here in the United States, which this president defies, and the EPA is cracking down on fracking, and they don't like Keystone Pipeline, and that all leads to a more stable America as it relates to foreign policy, because we're not beholden to the energy of Saudi Arabia, which sometimes does create a dangerous foreign policy.
So if I could indulge you and get you on the record for just one last question on a different subject. So yesterday, Speaker Boehner made news by saying that they would never conference with the Senate immigration bill. So it looks like immigration and border security legislation is not going to happen this year. You were involved in that from the get-go. So I was just wondering, what's your assessment on what's the way forward? Where is the Congress going to go from here over the next 12 months on this issue?
Well, I think we're going to do it the way the Founding Fathers envisioned us doing it, and that's through going through our committees with all representatives participating as a democracy rather than a backroom, closed-door, comprehensive bill. We've seen the dangers of comprehensive anything. This Obamacare disaster is a great case in point. When you throw about 8 members in a back room behind closed doors to concoct a policy within a matter of days, you're going to come up with bad policy. And that's precisely what we got with Obamacare. I don't want to see the border security piece or immigration reform go down that road of a few lawmakers making those high-level decisions behind closed doors without any transparency. So what happened, James, you're right. What happened, I said 2 things. One on Face the Nation was that we're not going to do comprehensive. We're going to go regular order. Leadership, they adopted that approach. And then, I came out again just recently saying we are not going to conference with the Senate Comprehensive Immigration Reform Bill because that's a disaster. It's basically an amnesty bill with billions of dollars thrown at the border without any rhyme or reason, no strategy or plans. As a fiscal conservative, it's offensive. That kind of money being thrown down there without any real plan behind it or strategy. So it really, it goes, my position is consistent with what I think we were intended to do, and that is go through the committees, have it fully debated by the representatives who represent the American people to participate in this debate, not some backroom deal. And I'm very pleased to say that I came out with this position that we're not going to conference with the Senate on CIR, on that bill. And Speaker Boehner, as of yesterday, came out and made that announcement. And I think it was a right decision because I think it's the right policy for the nation. And what we're going to do is, I hope, is we pass my security bills. I know Chairman Goodlatte has security bills as well. But I think the American people, first and foremost, want to know that we've got the security piece done right this time. As you know, in 1986, we granted amnesty, and we did nothing to entertain the security. And that's why we have the 10 to 15 million issue that we have today. I don't want to repeat the mistakes of 1986. So this time, I think we had to lead, first and foremost, with the security piece and get that done. Only through doing that are we going to have the confidence and the will of our conference to take on what I consider actually maybe the more difficult decisions when it comes to fixing our immigration system.
Thank you, sir. So if you bear with me, we're going to do a 2-step process here. First, I'm going to ask you to join with me in thanking the congressman, and then I'm going to ask our panel to jump up on the stage. I'm going to turn over to my colleague, Steve Bucci, who's going to introduce the panel and get that started. So please join with me in thanking the congressman.
Come on up.
can sit there. Okay. Thanks.
All right, as the panel comes forward, I'll get started so we can use up time. I'll also mention that at a certain point when this lovely lady in the corner waves at me, the congressman is going to get up and leave, and it's not because he's insulted by the last question I just asked. It's because he has to get somewhere else right at the end of our session here. So when he gets up, please understand why. This is a pretty important subject to me. I spent a lot of time in the United States Army as a Special Forces officer, so I tend to think like a terrorist, and I've spent a lot of time chasing terrorists. This is an important issue. I'm also responsible for all the homeland security and defense issues here at Heritage, so this means a lot to me. The panel we have here, I'm going to introduce them in just a second. We're going to do an interesting format. We're going to do basically a lightning round. I'm going to start asking questions. Each member of the panel is going to have no more than 3 minutes to respond to the question, and then we'll move down the line, and I'll ask the next one. I'll do that a couple of rounds, and then I'll look to all of you to ask some questions as well. If you don't, I'll ask some more, because I've got a whole list of them to ask them. You've already met Chairman McCaul, so I don't need to introduce him. He has agreed to stay as long as he can to continue to answer the questions. He's looking forward to this. He likes to answer questions. As you can see, he's pretty good at it. He is joined by a good friend of mine, Frank Salufo from George Washington University. Frank has a long history of figuring out how to defend this nation. That's all he does all the time, thinking about this there at GW. But he was one of the plank holders with the original Office of Homeland Security, and then helped stand up the Department of Homeland Security, working for the original Secretary, Tom Ridge. And we're glad to have him. Next to him, we have someone who I don't believe has ever been here at Heritage before on a panel, but Catherine Zimmerman. She is an expert on jihadist organizations, specifically al-Qaeda. She is a senior analyst and the al-Qaeda and associated movements team lead for the American Enterprise Institute's Critical Threats Project, and she is literally one of the experts in town on al-Qaeda on the Arabian Peninsula and its Somali affiliate, al-Shabaab. So we're glad to have her here. And then next to her, my colleague here at Heritage, Lisa Curtis. Lisa is our senior research fellow covering India, Pakistan, Afghanistan, and the rest of South Asia. So she's got a pretty big chunk to deal with. She has worked in the Senate Foreign Relations Committee, permanent or professional staff. She was also an advisor in the State Department, and prior to that was an analyst for the Central Intelligence Agency. Lisa has one of the most nuanced views of these subjects that I've seen, and it's my honor to work with her. And with that, I'm going to sit down at the other microphone and start asking questions.
Cool.
All right, and Congressman, you get to answer last on this one because you've already given part of the answer already. The first question, it's actually a two-part question. It's, have the tides of war really receded, and has al-Qaeda been essentially defeated?
Well, firstly, thank you for the opportunity to join you all. Steve, you do great work here. Heritage does great work, and privileged to serve on a panel with friends and colleagues. Let me start with the first question. If so, the enemy didn't get that memo. The reality is you've seen the threat metastasize. Yes, we have had some significant counterterrorism kinetic successes. Ding dong, the witch may be dead. We did get Osama bin Laden. But the reality is the threat lives on. And today it comes in various shapes, sizes, flavors, and forms. It's metastasized. And I think that Congressman McCaul laid out in a very concrete kind of way what it is we're dealing with right now. I mean, we still have an al-Qaeda senior leadership threat led by Ayman al-Zawahiri, operating out of the FATA, the federally administered tribal areas of Pakistan and Afghanistan. But I think even more significant than some of those challenges, you're starting to see huge swaths of and undergoverned spaces in Africa, from the Maghreb through the Sahel, You've got organizations such as Boko Haram operating out of Nigeria. You've got organizations such as Ansar al-Din operating out of Mali. You've got, obviously, al-Shabaab operating out of Somalia. And perhaps the most persistent threat from a U.S. national security perspective, al-Qaeda in the Arabian Peninsula operating out of Yemen. You've also seen the tides turn in Syria in a not-so-good way. I mean, this has become the magnet for all foreign fighters from Western countries, including the United States. At some point, they return. At some point, they go elsewhere. I am very concerned about them moving into Sochi. You've got, obviously, Putin taking very strong positions in the area, and you've got thousands of foreign fighters from the Caucasus. And you also have the potential magnet for great instability with the run-up to the Olympics. Not just the games themselves, but the run-up. You call it cushion shot terrorism. If you can't hit the target, you hit nearby the target. And that's precisely a major concern. You've seen al-Qaeda surge in Iraq. Bottom line is the threat is metastasized. It's not as hierarchical as it once was. It's a little more hybrid. And quite honestly, you see these guys swapping and sharing utility infield players. There's a lot of sharing going on, and that is not good from a U.S. national security standpoint. So no, where too many people etch that epitaph way too quickly.
Catherine?
Let me echo Frank in saying that it is an honor to be here today at Heritage, and I'm very happy to be on a panel with such distinguished speakers. No, the tide of war has not receded, and I strongly agree with what Frank put forward in that the enemy is actually looking to attack the United States even as we retreat from the region. And I think that's the difference, is that we want the tide of war to recede. It's not, and we can't wish war away. The question of whether al-Qaeda itself is essentially defeated is one that I started addressing in a report I put out in September that sought to define what the al-Qaeda network is today, and it's very different from the common conception that we hold that al-Qaeda is this group in Pakistan that is directing and pulling strings across the Muslim world. Al-Qaeda has changed, and it is now operating in a much stronger capacity across the Muslim world, in West Africa, in East Africa, North Africa, Yemen, Iraq, and it has taken the network that it had in Iraq, or in Syria, that was building its forces in Iraq, and has turned it around and has established a new franchise there. And so what we're seeing is the enemy adapting to current conditions in a way that, frankly, the US and the international forces are very slow to adapt to, because changing our military posture and our security posture abroad takes time. So when you're looking at whether the tide of war receding and whether our enemy is in fact being defeated, the answer is no. We're in a very dangerous position here today.
Lisa?
Yeah, I agree with my colleagues here. I think what we see is the nature of the terrorist threat is evolving, that because of the pressure that al-Qaeda's leadership has felt from our drones, particularly in Pakistan's tribal areas, they are relying increasingly, as my colleagues have said, on these organizations across the world. And the difference in the relationships between these various groups and al-Qaeda, we could talk a little bit about that. I mean, you've got, al-Shabaab, which I think can be viewed as an affiliate of al-Qaeda, in which there is direct command coming and very close relationships. Or you can look at a group like the Tehrik-i-Taliban Pakistan, the TTP, which would be an associated organization in that they share al-Qaeda ideology, they share resources, training. There may not be a command and control relationship, but there is still linkages and associations. And I think what we should understand is that this strategy does fall in line with a speech that Ayman al-Zawahiri made on the 12th anniversary of the 9/11 attacks, in which he called on jihadists to attack from safe bases where they had a stronghold, from their local locations. And I think it would be useful for us to view the threat in this way, in which we're seeing a network of affiliated groups conducting attacks across the world, sharing this ideology, and still posing a threat to U.S. national security interests. And this idea that al-Qaeda is on its last legs is just not accurate. Yes, we have made gains against al-Qaeda, particularly through our drone strikes in Pakistan's tribal areas, but this has caused al-Qaeda to rely on affiliate organizations and to devolve its decision-making, which is helping the organization stay on the map, and it's sustaining that al-Qaeda brand.
Chairman?
Yeah, I agree with Frank and the other speakers. It's changed. It's evolved a lot. I think, as you mentioned, a lot of the top al-Qaeda leadership from the 9/11 days have been killed or captured, gotten good information. I saw Khalid Sheikh Mohammed dead in Guantanamo. It was very spooky. I mean, it was at prayer hour time, and we haven't broken him, and we haven't broken al-Qaeda. I think it's probably easier. A 9/11 type cell would be easier to stop today because of the changes we've made. We can penetrate those cells a lot easier. First of all, it's harder for them to get in the United States. And then once they are, we can penetrate them more easily. Having said that, it's not just Pakistan and Afghanistan anymore. It is, as was demonstrated, Africa, all throughout the Middle East, what they call the Caliphate, Syria, and they're all training there. And Americans are going over there to train. And where are they going to go when it's over? They're going to probably come back here. And that's a threat to the homeland. I would argue that the threat is increasing, not decreasing, because it's spreading. Now, are we going to see smaller scale operations? Probably, but those are precisely the ones that are most difficult to detect, deter, and disrupt, which is always the JTTF mantra. Like the Boston case, although we had warnings there, we disregarded some of the warnings. But the Boston example is probably what we're going to see more of. Now, a lot of these affiliates spreading and franchises evolving are more interested in taking over the region and establishing that sort of caliphate idea. However, there are some that are still very intent on destroying the West. Zawahiri, as you mentioned, I think that speech he gave was very significant. And in fact, it was around the same time. Remember, we had this alert, this intelligence alert that came out, and we shut down 20 embassies. That was a real threat. And they knew that we knew, and they backed off. But the capability of that threat happening again, I think is very real. And so I personally think these smaller scale things, going back to who's intent on really still hitting the West, AQAP, aviation threat. They're still experimenting chemical explosives. You talk about the forces in Pakistan. They're still very intense. So there are factions that still very much want to hit the West, which, to my last point, for the life of me, I try to understand, why is this president, the narrative I call it, why does he keep saying, he doesn't say radical Islam anymore, they don't say war on terror, they don't use that terminology, they want to wish it away, I think, as you stated, when it's real. So I just ask the question, why? Why would he be doing this? And the only thing I can conclude is that it was his goal to say that he ended Bush's wars. And that's what his goal is, leaving his second term, is I ended these wars, and it's over, and it's pre-9/11. Let's deal with these as criminal cases, not prosecute them from a military perspective, because that's to his advantage to say that he got, goal accomplished. Well, you know what? He hasn't accomplished that goal. And by denying it, it frankly puts us in a more dangerous situation.
Okay, Catherine, you get to go first on this one. And I'm going to trip you up a little bit. I did give these folks the questions ahead of time, so I'm going to combine this one, mostly because I know the congressman is going to get close to getting ready to leave, and I want to hear his answer too. Okay, we've talked about this law enforcement versus the military view. And my initial question was, can we afford to again adopt that view, but I'm going to throw it to the larger one. I'd like the four of you to describe and contrast the differences between the counterterrorism approaches of the Clinton, Bush, and Obama administrations and how that works. And Catherine, you get to go first.
Thank you. I think I'm going to actually work backwards to some degree, since that's the easiest position. And what Obama has done is essentially adopted a counterterrorism strategy that has defined this core enemy group, and it's changed as to who that is, but it's based on threat. When he started in office, it was the al-Qaeda senior leadership based in Pakistan. After al-Qaeda in the Arabian Peninsula, the group in Yemen, attacked the United States, AQAP became part of that core group and was part of this, was included as a target for this strategy. And then after the Tehrik-e-Taliban Pakistan attacked the United States in May 2010 in Times Square, that group was then added and incorporated into this core enemy grouping of al-Qaeda. The way that the administration has chosen to pursue these operatives and leaders is by conducting drone strikes or direct military action. Very few captures have resulted from this in a loss of intelligence. And then to deal with kind of the other threat, so the affiliates that aren't directly threatening the US homeland, potentially the groups that might be supporting al-Qaeda elsewhere, the idea is to outsource the fight to a local partner, which is varied across the board as to whether it is an African Union peacekeeping mission in Somalia, the Yemeni military forces in Yemen, or actual militia forces fighting elsewhere in Mali, for example. That strategy is one that the Obama administration took from the Bush administration and has not changed overall. The major inflection point was after the 9/11 attacks, when the Bush administration decided to adopt a very hard counterterrorism strategy that directly pursued the leadership of al-Qaeda in a way that the Clinton administration didn't. Clinton chose to pursue it in a law enforcement way. What we saw was a punitive strike after the 1998 embassy bombing, one in Khartoum, Sudan, and one in Afghanistan, where al-Qaeda itself had some safe haven, but really no effective way of combating the area that al-Qaeda was operating in, and the government, and punishing the governments who were supporting it. So what I'm calling for, and I think what many who look at this issue are calling for, is a new approach to counterterrorism that starts to get at the issue itself, rather than treating just a core group based on an action that they've already taken, but actually being more forward-leaning in identifying the threats before they hit here at home.
Yeah, I think if we weaken the tools that, I think looking at the terrorism threat as strictly a law enforcement issue would weaken the tools that we have to confront this threat. I mean, there's a reason we have not had another 9/11 style attack in the US. We have strengthened our laws. We have strengthened our intelligence sharing with governments overseas. We've put a lot of resources. We've reorganized, government agencies to focus on the threat. And I think it would be wise for us to remember one of the things that they said in the 9/11 Commission report, which was the 9/11 attacks were a result of a failure of imagination of our analysts. So I don't think we would do ourselves any favors by trying to whitewash or forget that there are still terrorists out there that are plotting, planning, trying to attack us. And so I would say that we need to, stay on a war footing. Okay, you don't want to use the word war, fine, but at the same time, we have to stay mobilized in the way that we have been. And when you talk about the differences between the different administrations, I just want to say briefly, because I was a diplomat serving in Pakistan in the mid-1990s during the rise of the Taliban in Afghanistan, and I was personally very frustrated for the lack of attention that Washington was giving to the problems that I could see developing in Pakistan. You could see this proliferation of terrorist groups sprouting up, the Mujahideen fighters from Afghanistan, coming into Pakistan, starting to, focus on India, Kashmir, but at the same time retaining this, Islamist, pan-Islamist violent ideology. And you could see this growing in Pakistan during those years. And so I think that we need to remember, yes, threat is spreading, but there is still a major threat coming out of Pakistan, where you have probably more terrorist groups than any other country in the world sort of conglomerating in those tribal areas bordering Afghanistan. And just a final word on the drones. Obviously the Obama administration has vastly increased its dependence on drone strikes, particularly in Pakistan. This has been effective, but it's an interesting paradox that at the same time, the Obama administration tries to say, the terrorist threat is receding, there's no longer a threat that we need to worry about, but yet they have, increased the drone program quite a bit from what the Bush administration had done. And I just think that it's unhelpful to try to publicly downplay the threat, because then you lose the support of the American people. And we need to be clear on the threats we face, because if we don't define the threats, we're not going to address them appropriately.
Mr. Chairman.
That's a brilliant panel. A lot of expertise. I think this core al-Qaeda concept that we've wiped out the top leadership and therefore it's over is a false premise. Al-Qaeda is al-Qaeda, and it's spreading, not diminishing. And I agree, Pakistan is still I've been over there many times, and Afghanistan, and it is one of the spookiest places I've ever been to. And it is getting worse. Going back to the question, I remember in 1993, the World Trade Center bombing, and a lot of us kind of looked around like, who are these people? These radical Islamic types, but we didn't really understand what they represented. Most Americans, they just thought they were just a bunch of crazy, they probably are, but crazy people. Well, what happened? Ramzi Youssef leaves the United States, meets up with his uncle Khalid Sheikh Mohammed. They discuss flying airplanes into buildings as cruise missiles. And we know what happened with 9/11. It was treated as a criminal case. And whereas it was really a military threat to the security of the United States. So I think what they've tried to do is say, core al-Qaeda is defeated, therefore let's revert back to the Clinton administration's policy of using it's a law enforcement issue now, and we'll treat it as such, and we will prosecute these cases. And I think that's a bit dangerous. And I point out Benghazi in my speech because we still haven't found, there are 13 individuals indicted under seal, and we have yet to capture them. I would argue that while I have great admiration and respect for the FBI, I think our special forces are much better equipped to go after these suspects, to capture them. And it is overseas, and it was American soil and an embassy, and it killed our ambassador. So I think it is a bit dangerous, but it's all part, again, I think, of this narrative. Frank, do you have any?
Yeah, just to build on that, let's start current and then go backwards. I agree that I think this president's uncomfortable discussing these issues. I actually have a hard time figuring out what some of our policies are vis-a-vis counterterrorism, and allegedly I look at this all the time. But the flip side is you've also seen a dramatic increase in the use of drones and direct action with our special forces, which I've been a huge advocate for. You've seen some of the synchronization of Titles 10 and Title 50, where intelligence meets DOD. And some of that is good. My concern is this: is it a panacea? Is it a silver bullet? No, there are no silver bullets. It is a round I want in my chamber, I'll tell you that much, but it's by no means the end-all, be-all. Law enforcement, during my years in the Bush White House, and obviously I'm biased, we were dealing with a different level of gravity. It was instantaneous. Our community grew up out of the Cold War. We were still dealing with tank on tank, plane on plane, state on state. So it was a huge transformation in terms of trying to integrate all the various agencies, entities that had a role in counterterrorism. I think we probably lean too much in counterinsurgency. I would prefer light footprints in, out, and quite honestly, we can't afford a coin approach going forward. In the Clinton years, I would sum up their foreign policy with 2 words: tomahawk missiles and dollar diplomacy. That was their answer for everything. And I do think it focused too heavily on law enforcement. They didn't grasp the gravity of the issues. Although I'll say I testified many times and everyone thought I was crazy too. So maybe there were a lot of people before 9/11 on al-Qaeda who didn't want to see the problem. But I do think law enforcement, here's the thing, I don't see these as either-or propositions. At the end of the day, law enforcement at the federal level, the FBI plays a critical role. But more importantly, when we're dealing with the homegrown jihadi threat, state and local law enforcement is part of that solution. The role our major PDs play, the role sheriffs and local law enforcement plays, I think, is as critical to some of these challenges as anyone else on the homegrown side. That said, to Mr. McCaul's point, we want to keep it over there as much as we can, and let's be serious. That's going to be primarily a military response.
If I can just add, and Frank makes a good point. And when it's in the homeland, I think FBI has the lead, and they need to work with state and locals more effectively, like the Boston experience, to counter, that threat. And I also agree with more of a light and lethal force. We can't occupy countries anymore, and I think a counterterrorism footprint is very important to stop the future bin Ladens out there. I've always been an advocate, actually right after 9/11, that we should have, good intelligence, special operations, and yes, drones are effective, and they're part of the toolkit, not the only tool.
Exactly.
And that together is, we should have just gone into Afghanistan after bin Laden, killed the Taliban and al-Qaeda there, and gotten rid of the threat. But it got a little misguided as time went on. Drones can't kill an ideology, though. They have been effective, but they are not going to kill an ideology. At the end of the day, this is a war of ideology. And I think we win because our ideology is the right one. An ideology of hatred and teaching children to strap, suicide vests on them. It's a famous quote of Golda Meir: "Till they love their own children more than they hate us, this struggle will continue." And she was correct. So how do we counter that? This is a broader, that's not, like you said, a silver bullet military answer or law enforcement. We have to start thinking in an unconventional sense of what role the moderate Muslim can play to help us. Because the more the moderate Muslim, I think, is one of the most effective weapons we have to counter this radical ideology that is impacting poor nations where you have vacuums opened up that al-Qaeda flourishes in. How do we counter that ideology? I think we have to do a better job of PR messaging through the Muslim community to get that to win that ideology. At the end of the day, as long as they believe this stuff, they're going to continue to kill us. And so I think at the end of the day, that's where we need to be focused as well.
Stole all my thunder for the next question.
Oh, sorry.
You're getting the hook, Congressman, so you have to know.
Well, what's the next question?
I've been in her shoes. I know how hard she's working to try and get you to your next meeting on time. Okay, I'm going to switch it up real quick, and I'll let the congressman go first so he can answer it. Because this was not on the list, so you guys
I didn't know we agreed on that.
flex with me. Based on what the congressman just led with about this ideological component of it, how do you see terrorist groups, particularly al-Qaeda and its buddies, using the internet, using cyber means, both for this ideological piece of the struggle and the potential for using it for other things?
Well, I mean, Inspire magazine is a great example of how they can use the internet to inspire. That was the whole goal of the al-Awlaki's publication. It impacted the Boston Brothers and impacts many others. I would argue there are radical websites all across the world that preach this radical Islamic ideology. And when you looked at Tamerlan, when he came back from Russia, as the Russians warned us, if we'd just taken a second look at him, we would have seen these radical websites that he created about the black flags of Khorasan, which is Afghanistan, and he was clearly radicalized at this point in time. So the internet plays a tremendous role in radicalization of not globally, but also what I'm most concerned about as Chairman of Homeland Security, radicalization within this country. And that's a hard thing to stop. And we talk about monitoring websites, and then you get into privacy concerns. And so I think that has a heavy part to play. Not to get in, this would be another hour discussion on the cybersecurity aspects of what Iran's trying to do currently in attacking our financial institutions and such. But I think the internet is it's a tremendous force in a positive way, but it can be a very destructive force when it comes to preaching hatred and radical Islamic ideology, and it's working, and it worked in the Boston case as well. And I'm sorry, I guess I do have to leave with that. But
not a problem. Thank you very
Steve,
much,
such
sir.
an honor. Frank, thank you so much. Really appreciate it.
Just join me in thanking the Congressman. The rest of you don't get up yet because we're not done. All right, Frank?
I mean, the internet is critical to the facilitation of the radical jihadi and Islamist ideology. I mean, al-Qaeda lives and breathes on the internet. So the question is, what do we do about it? And and by and large, when we talk about internet-facilitated radicalization, it's for spreading the ideology, but also for tradecraft purposes, to communicate, to identify targets, for intelligence collection. This is for fundraising and the like, and reaffirming aberrant attitudes with like-minded radicals writ large. But I mean, the question then becomes, so what do we do? We basically have three options. One, you can try to shut these sites down, which is a bit like whack-a-mole. I mean, I think we do need to push this to the edge as far as we can. So I do feel there's more we can do on that. Two, we can obviously use it for intelligence exploitation, as I think it's fair to say we have, and as long as it's got intel value, you don't necessarily want to shut it down. You want to try to get a sense of who their associates are, what their intentions are, what their plans are, and the anonymity of cyberspace can also be used to our advantage because they don't know who they're necessarily communicating with because you don't know who's behind the clickety-clack of the keyboard. Three, though, is where I think we have so much more that can be done. It's time to push back, expose the hypocrisy, expose the lies, expose it for what it is. It's ideologically bankrupt. And it's not necessarily trying to bring them to our side. It's exposing theirs for being bankrupt. And we have not done enough, in my eyes. In fact, we've done very little to expose the hypocrisy of their ideology. And here's what I would like to see. Every time they show a martyr, why do we know suicide, homicide bombers' names? I want to know the victims' names, not the perpetrator. Yet we, even in the West, focus on the bad guy. Well, what about all the women and the children and the elderly and everyone else who's been killed at the hands of an IED by al-Qaeda or suicide/homicide bombing or whatever other attack? Why don't we know the stories of the little kids, what their dreams were, what their hopes were, what their opportunities were? But I know the jackass's story. That's got to change. We've got to flip that on its head and expose the hypocrisy of the narrative and flourish in terms of highlighting and spotlighting the narrative of those who've lost their lives at the hands of al-Qaeda's violence. To me, we've done nothing there. That's a little creativity needs to be part of that. It's not just government. In fact, it's probably not really government. Let's bring in Silicon Valley. Let's bring in Bangalore, wherever. This has to be elsewhere as well. And let's have a dead Facebook for those that have been killed by al-Qaeda. So I've been on this one for a long time. As you can tell, I seem to be singing in the woods, but we still can do so much more in that space.
Catherine?
The question about cyberspace is fascinating to me because these groups use it to reach out to individuals that they wouldn't be able to for various reasons, geographically, because we raise a red flag whenever someone travels to some of these reasons, and because they're able to translate it and get their message out in kind of a colloquial English or whatever language you're speaking. And that's one of the things that Inspire, AQAP's magazine, did, was it took what used to be a very, very hard text, hard ideology that was in Arabic, in not even standard, not even kind of regular, everyday Arabic, and put it into American English. And that made it much more accessible, much more relatable to many of these individuals. As Frank pointed out, it's hard to crack down on the internet space because it is so malleable and because it's so adaptive for many of these groups. If you shut down even a Twitter handle, within an hour you can see the group come up and gain followers in that time period. The one interesting thing that I have found with cyber is that we haven't seen an attack conducted purely from the internet. There hasn't been the lone wolf, self-radicalized individual out of the al-Qaeda network. There's been some form of personal contact, with the exception, if you will, of the email exchange between Nidal Hassan and Sheikh Anwar al-Awlaki, where that was a personal form of communication over the internet, but he was directly mobilized by an individual in the al-Qaeda network. Even with the Boston bombers, one of them went to Dagestan and didn't simply take what was told to him over the internet and build a bomb. It's very likely that he received training over there and joined up in the militant group. The other side of cyber, which is sometimes forgotten, is that we have an immense cyber infrastructure in the United States, outside of the government, in the commercial industry, in our economic sphere, that is vulnerable to attacks. And that is a space that hasn't been exploited yet, but it's probably the new frontier. And we need to start preparing ourselves in a way to be at the front of that so that we are able to conduct both defensive and offensive operations in that space before we see the enemy doing it, as we've seen Iran try.
Can I just say that what I was discussing was more internet facility, the CNA, computer network attack issues are very, I just came from, I was on, the head of Cybercom and I were just on a panel this morning on that. So that's a different set of questions from my perspective. So I didn't mean to touch that.
I'd like to just emphasize what Congressman McCaul said about the need to empower and engage with moderate Muslim communities throughout the world. One of the main points that al-Qaeda tries to push is that this is a religious battle between Christians and Muslims. And this is something that we need to do a much better job of countering and demonstrating that, no, this is about al-Qaeda exploiting the religion of Islam to sow chaos, destruction, overturn governments. And it's a pointless agenda. And thousands upon thousands of Muslims are being killed as part of this agenda, intentionally. So these are the points that we need to get across, and we need to work with, our Muslim allies throughout the world. And I'll come back to Pakistan because that's what I spend the majority of my time doing.
So are they an ally, Lisa?
Pakistan is a partner. It's an important partner, and it's an important partner that we need to remain engaged with. As frustrating as it can be, I think it's enormously important for us to remain engaged with the Pakistan government. But there is confusion in Pakistan. We saw it just last week when Hakimullah Masood, the leader of the Pakistani Taliban, which, by the way, has killed thousands of Pakistani security forces and civilians over the last 6 years, was killed by one of our drone strikes. Now, we had our own interest in making sure he was taken off the battlefield because of his involvement in the 2010 attempt on Times Square, bombing attempt, as well as the attack on the base in Khost, which killed 7 CIA officers. But he's also a threat to Pakistan. So the fact that some Pakistani officials prevaricated, criticized the U.S. for making the drone strike, some religious leaders even were calling him a martyr, which for the first time ever you saw the senior Pakistani military officials coming out and criticizing this religious political leader for heroizing Haki Mullah Masood. So it's been a very interesting debate in Pakistan, and I think it's good that they're having this debate, but we can also play a role in helping to clarify who the enemy is in Pakistan. And I just want to quote al-Zawahiri made very clear in this speech that he gave a couple of months ago how important Pakistan was to al-Qaeda's overall strategy. He said that their fighting aims at creating a safe haven for the Mujahideen in Pakistan, which can then be used as a launching pad for the struggle of establishing an Islamic system. So clearly Pakistan is in the crosshairs of al-Qaeda, and we're talking about a nuclear armed state. So I just can't emphasize enough the importance of our partnership with Pakistan in defeating the global threat.
Okay, I'm going to actually tell the truth. I lied. I didn't lie intentionally, but I'm not going to give you guys a chance to ask questions. I'm going to ask the final question, and I think these guys will hang at least for a few minutes to answer any particular ones you have. So this will be your wrap-up, so you can kind of take it any direction you want. But given how agile AQ and the other Islamist extremist groups are at working and doing what they do, and the fact that I think they can pivot a lot faster than we can in a lot of these areas, what is the single biggest change that we can make, change or adjustment that we can make in the United States to be more effective in fighting against the threat of terrorism? And you can take it international, homeland, however you want to take it. And we'll go this way. So Frank, you go first, and then Catherine, then
Sure.
Lisa.
I mean, a couple of quick thoughts here at the end. One, it is the ideology stupid, to paraphrase Bill Clinton, that we've got to be able to address the ideological underpinnings of the adversary, which we haven't done. Two, what people don't fully recognize or realize, why Fatah, why Sahel, why Maghreb, why Somalia? These are and undergoverned spaces. They live and breathe in undergoverned spaces. I'm very concerned if we ease off the pressure, ease off the gas pedal, those spaces will be even further filled, and the few areas we think we are having some marginal success will likely be filled by others. And by that, I mean, drones are by no means the panacea, but if you read any of the Abbottabad documents, Osama bin Laden made clear that was their number one fear, because they were worried about getting hit with a drone strike. In fact, that's playing out right now with TTP, with Tariq-i-Taliban and some of the new leadership, whether or not they should move back to Pakistan, because he will be on a potential list. So don't underestimate suppressive fire. The less time that they have plotting, training, and executing attacks, the better. I'd rather them looking over their shoulders than enabling that. So ideological and undergoverned spaces, light footprints to be able to fill that space, direct action, working in what's called unconventional warfare, working with some of our allies in the region. The African countries don't have the capacity. Very different than the challenges in Pakistan or Afghanistan or even in Yemen. But when you start looking at the Sahel, the Maghreb, and elsewhere, it's much more of a capacity issue. And then finally, allies do matter here. I never thought I'd say this, but Vive la France, they've actually stepped up, whether it's in Mali or elsewhere. So I'll leave it at that.
You know, it's funny. I was thinking I was going to have to say something nice about France.
I've never.
Since they're the ones fighting al-Qaeda in Mali. I think that I want to lay out what I see as one of the biggest challenges, and probably not how to address that challenge, since I don't really have that answer yet. The ability of al-Qaeda and our enemies to pivot quickly is one of the most challenging issues facing our counterterrorism strategy. And the reason that they're able to do this is they're actually on the ground in these places at a local level. They have insights that we, the US government, don't have, because we don't have a chain of human intel that goes down to the village level in all of these places, whereas al-Qaeda is operating from the ground up. And that is severely handicapped our ability to change our policy quickly, to actually identify the needs of the people that al-Qaeda has stepped in and filled in many cases, where even though al-Qaeda, the issue is the ideology, in many cases, in Pakistan, Afghanistan, and everywhere else that al-Qaeda is operating, it's not the ideology that is drawing support from the local fighters, from the population. It's al-Qaeda's ability to play into anti-government sentiments, fill in governance gaps, fill in basic needs, water, food, education. You know, you hear this and it's something we don't think about in the United States because we have it all. But when someone's giving you that and you don't have it, you'll probably let them stick around for a little bit. And what that gives al-Qaeda is space. So the issue for us is that we've handicapped ourselves to some degree because where al-Qaeda operates is insecure, which means that our personnel face immense security challenges and operational challenges going there and delivering and working with the local populations. And in many of these regions, as Frank noted, Africa being a continent of underdeveloped militaries and security forces and governments, they have their own limited capacities and capabilities to do what we need them to do. So I don't think that we will be able to really address the al-Qaeda challenge until we have the insights that al-Qaeda has by being with the people and working day to day with the people. And that's something you see play out in the leadership. The al-Qaeda leadership has, you know, the same issue that the US government does to some case, where it says, this is what we should be doing, and the ground commander says, no, really, we shouldn't be doing that. We don't have that kind of dialogue happening. We only have the top commander saying, this is what we need to do. So until we're on the ground and until we can see what's happening, we won't be able to adapt the way that al-Qaeda has adapted.
Lisa?
Okay, so how can we improve our effectiveness in addressing this evolving threat? We've talked about the importance of engaging moderate Muslim communities, addressing the ideological threat. We've talked about the need for our own leadership, our own president and other U.S. officials to be clear that we are still under threat and that it's too early to sound the death knell for al-Qaeda. And lastly, I'd like to hit on a point. I think Frank is right that the lighter footprint strategy is probably what we're going to have to rely on moving forward, just because the threat is so diffuse and spread throughout the world, and we just simply don't have the resources to deploy large troop deployments throughout the world every time there's a terrorist strike in a country. That said, this does not mean that we should withdraw precipitously from Afghanistan. We still have, about 50,000 troops there. We are ending combat operations as of the end of next year, but we need to maintain a fairly robust residual presence there. Otherwise, we're going to sacrifice everything that we have invested in over the last 12 years there. And if the Taliban is able to come back, control large parts of the country, allow al-Qaeda to reestablish its safe havens there, this will be so emboldening to al-Qaeda and all of its affiliates throughout the world. It'll have a devastating impact on our overall ability to get a handle on the threat. So I think whereas moving forward, yes, we have to think in terms of this light footprint, let's not rush for the exits in Afghanistan. Let's recognize that we still have work to do in stabilizing the government, supporting the government, supporting the Afghan security forces, because that would be just a major blow to our overall global counterterrorism strategy if the Taliban is able to come back in Afghanistan.
I agree with that.
Well, folks, for any of you that know me, you know I'm kind of obsessive compulsive about time. So the fact that I let this run over 16 minutes tells you, this is important stuff, right? This is not an ancillary issue. It is the key issue we're facing right now in our country. So I want you to join me in thanking the panel. This is a great group. You definitely got more than your money's worth, and thank all of you for being here with us. Thank you very much.